The summer air in 1972 carried with it a kind of lightness, the sort of brightness that makes ordinary days feel endless. In a small town tucked between rolling hills and winding creeks, a playground stood as its own center of gravity. It was a place of ritual, children running barefoot through the grass, the swings swaying back and forth in squeaky arcs, a seesaw rising and falling with the cadence of laughter. The sound of a metal slide, polished smooth by years of use, rang like a bell whenever a child raced down. Mothers chatted at the park's edge, fathers on their way home from work sometimes stopping just long enough to catch sight of their children before dinner. It was the portrait of innocence, framed by sunlight and familiarity. But innocence is fragile. It can shatter in a breath, and on one particular afternoon, it did. What began as an ordinary day, indistinguishable from the hundreds that had come before it, would end in silence so heavy that the town itself seemed to stop breathing. 5 children, each no older than 11, each full of the boundless energy that defines youth, vanished between the hours of play and supper. It was not a storm or a tragedy marked by violence in the open, it was something quieter, more chilling, the absence of sound where there should have been noise. The swings that had held their weight continued to sway for a moment, moved only by the memory of momentum. A ball that had been thrown rolled slowly into the grass, coming to rest against a rusted fence. What lingered in the air was not screaming, not chaos, but an eerie stillness, the kind that makes you wonder whether time itself has paused. Parents called out, voices casual at first, an everyday beckoning to come home. Then the tone sharpened, names repeated more firmly, until the realization began to take shape. No footsteps approached, no voices answered. It is difficult to convey the rupture that follows such an absence. To the mothers and fathers, it was as though a veil had dropped between the moment of laughter and the silence that followed. 1,000 thoughts rushed in at once. Had the children wandered off? Had they hidden as a game? Had they grown lost in the woods just beyond the playground? Denial is the first shadow that grief casts, and in those early minutes, denial was all anyone could cling to. They searched the corners of the park, looked behind the slide, beneath the wooden benches, into the tall grass that swayed in the breeze. Nothing. Not a trace. What makes the story so haunting is how ordinary the day was before the rupture. There were no warnings, no strange cars parked at the edge of the field, no figure lurking in the periphery that anyone remembered. The children had been visible, accounted for, moments before. Their shoes pressed into the dirt, their voices rang across the open space, and then, impossibly, they were gone. That impossibility is what has echoed across half a century. How can 5 lives slip away in the span of a single afternoon without anyone seeing, without the world itself leaving behind a clue? The memory of that day remains preserved in fragments, recollections pieced together through interviews, old newspaper clippings, and the worn retellings of parents and neighbors. Some remember the heat of the sun, others the sound of the ice cream truck drifting faintly in the distance. One mother recalls tying her daughter's hair ribbon before sending her off to play, holding onto the image of the bow as if it could anchor her to reality. These details do not answer the mystery, but they frame it in human texture. They make the children real, not names in a file but bodies that once cast shadows on the sand. As the hours passed and the sun sank below the tree line, the tone of the town shifted. What had been playful calls grew into frantic shouts, echoing into the darkening woods. Lanterns and flashlights pierced the dusk, beams of light slicing across fields and fences. The transition from day to night carried with it a sense of finality, as if once the sun disappeared, the chance of seeing the children again would vanish with it. Night has always belonged to fear, and on that night, fear claimed every street, every household, every corner of the playground. The opening of this story is not about the mechanics of disappearance, but about the weight of absence. It is about the moment laughter turned into silence, about how a small playground, designed to hold joy, became a wound that never healed. Decades later, those who were there still describe it not as a scene they watched unfold, but as something that happened to them personally, like a scar branded onto memory. A town can recover from storms, from fires, from floods. But what happened in 1972 was not a natural disaster. It was something more elusive, more unrelenting. It was the erasure of 5 children from the fabric of everyday life, and with them, the erasure of certainty itself. That afternoon lives on as an echo. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes, the creak of swings moving without riders, the faint rattle of chains in the wind, the laughter fading into an empty silence. The echo does not answer the questions that came later, but it does something else. It reminds us how quickly everything can change, how easily the familiar can fracture. It is not the kind of story one chooses to remember, yet it is also not one that can ever be forgotten. The town itself seems small enough to hold in the palm of a hand. Nestled in a valley carved by old rivers and shadowed by low, forested hills, it was a place that many maps never bothered to label. A single main street ran its course through the center, lined with brick-front stores that smelled faintly of dust and tobacco. There was the diner with its squeaky leather booths, the post office where gossip traveled faster than mail, and a grocery that doubled as a social hub where neighbors exchanged recipes alongside rumors. The town existed in a rhythm that had barely changed in decades. It was, to those who lived there, a place untouched by the storms of the outside world. Safety was not just assumed here, it was a way of life. Doors were left unlocked, bicycles were abandoned in front yards overnight, and parents measured time not by watches but by the sound of their children's laughter drifting from the playground. The playground itself was the heart of the town. It wasn't grand or modern, just a patch of dirt, a handful of metal structures painted in fading colors, and a bench where mothers often sat with thermoses of coffee. Yet it symbolized something larger, a collective trust, a belief that the community would keep its children safe because everyone's eyes were always watching, always caring. But that trust, as history would prove, was fragile. What makes this place so haunting is not that it was dangerous but that it seemed, for so long, completely insulated from danger. No one could imagine that harm could find its way into such a pocket of quiet living. When tragedies happen in large cities, they are often absorbed into the endless churn of noise and motion. In this town, however, one tragedy reverberated like a bell, and it never stopped ringing. The people who lived here were deeply tied to one another. Families had been neighbors for generations, and children often bore the same surnames that could be traced back through local cemeteries. It was a community built on continuity, grandparents in rocking chairs watching their grandchildren play where their own children once had. This deep-rooted familiarity made the disappearance of the 5 children feel like not just a crime against individuals but an attack on the identity of the entire town. To lose one child was unimaginable. To lose 5, at once, from the very space that defined their innocence, was to rupture the foundation on which everyone's lives were built. When the news spread that evening, that the children hadn't come home from the playground, neighbors spilled into the streets. People who rarely raised their voices shouted names into the gathering dark. The sheriff, a man more accustomed to handling disputes over fences or the occasional petty theft, found himself standing in the center of Main Street with nothing to offer but uncertainty. His cruiser's headlights cut through the night, but they illuminated nothing. The townspeople looked to him for answers, but all he could do was shake his head. It was as though the collective trust that had bound everyone together had evaporated in a single moment. The days that followed altered the way the town breathed. Once vibrant storefronts closed early, curtains stayed drawn, and conversations shifted into whispers. Mothers gripped their children's hands tighter, fearful of even letting them step onto porches. The playground, once a place of joy, became a monument to loss. Its swings creaked not with the weight of children but with the push of the wind, and every sound it made reminded people of the laughter that should have been there but wasn't. The tragedy reshaped how the town understood itself. Before, it had been a place defined by routine and safety, where everyone's business was everyone else's comfort. After, it became a place where silence lingered behind every exchange, where even the friendliest smile carried a shadow of suspicion. People wondered if the answer had always been hiding among them, if someone they had trusted might have betrayed that trust in the most unthinkable way. That quiet paranoia seeped into the town's soil and refused to leave. Half a century later, the story of the vanished children is still the town's central axis. Outsiders know it for that mystery alone, while insiders carry the double burden of grief and reputation. The buildings have aged, the paint on the houses has peeled, but the memory of 1972 still pulses like a wound that has never closed. To speak of the town is to speak of that afternoon, of that playground, of the names that are still whispered like prayers. What makes the story of this town compelling is the tension between what it was and what it became. Once defined by the simplicity of rural trust, it is now a place permanently shadowed by what it lost. The identity of the town cannot be separated from the memory of those 5 children, whose absence reshaped everything. It is not just a mystery of where they went but also a mystery of how a community continues after the unthinkable has happened. This is the town that time forgot, and yet time has never let it forget. Would you like me to continue expanding Section 3 in the same atmospheric, narrative-driven style, hitting the 1,200 words target, or pause here so you can review the flow? The last day the children were seen began like countless others in the small town, quiet, sunlit, and seemingly safe. It was early June, when school had just released for summer and the world felt wide open to those too young to measure time by calendars or responsibilities. For the 5 children who would vanish, it was meant to be a day of play, a day to stretch out against the sky and soak in the endless promise of youth. They had no reason to believe it would be any different. And perhaps that is what makes the memory of it so unbearable. The ordinariness, the fact that nothing seemed remarkable until everything changed. Their names are still remembered, whispered almost like a litany. Each of them carried their own piece of the town's heartbeat. There was the oldest, an 11-year-old boy who had just learned how to fix a bicycle chain and proudly showed the younger kids how to do it. He had the protective air of a big brother, even to children who weren't his siblings, the kind of boy who would walk a friend home if they were afraid of the dark. His sister, a quiet girl of 9, followed him everywhere, always carrying a small notebook in which she scribbled drawings, houses, flowers, birds, dreams too large for the page. Another of the 5 was an energetic 8-year-old boy with a laugh that carried farther than the church bells on Sunday mornings. He was known for his pockets, always bulging with marbles, string, bottle caps, treasures he found and refused to part with. Beside him was his best friend, a wiry boy of 7 with a love for stories. He would sit under the big oak tree near the slide and spin tales of pirates and treasure maps, holding the others in rapt attention. And then there was the youngest, a 6-year-old girl whose red ribbon was tied neatly into her hair that morning. She was shy, often holding her brother's hand, but when she smiled, it lit up her whole face. These details matter, not just because they make the children real, but because they anchor the story in humanity. They were not faceless names on a missing persons flyer, they were children with quirks and habits, with voices that carried through the fields. They had parents who knew the cadence of their footsteps, who could recognize their laughter from across the street. And on that day in June, those footsteps and voices were everywhere, until suddenly they weren't. The morning passed uneventfully. Some children helped with chores before running off to the playground, others grabbed peanut butter sandwiches or apples before dashing outside. The sun was bright, the kind of heat that shimmered against the pavement and warmed the rusted monkey bars until they burned little palms. Neighbors recall seeing the group gathered together, running between the swings and the seesaw, arguing over whose turn it was to climb the slide ladder. A local shopkeeper remembered selling a soda to the older boy earlier that afternoon, his sister waiting by the door with her notebook tucked under her arm. These recollections, pieced together like shards of broken glass, are all that remain of the timeline. As the day wore on, the children remained at the playground, their laughter carrying over the grass fields. Around mid-afternoon, the sound of the ice cream truck drifted faintly from a distance. Some said they saw the children run toward the corner of the park where the truck often stopped. Others remember them circling back toward the swings. The details blur, contradict, overlap. Memory is imperfect, and trauma distorts it further, leaving behind fragments instead of clarity. But what everyone agrees on is that, as the sun began to sink lower, the playground slowly emptied, except for those 5. By early evening, the first calls rang out from porches. Mothers leaned on screen doors, calling names into the warm air, expecting the familiar rush of footsteps back home. Fathers returning from work set down their lunch pails and scanned the street for familiar figures. But the children did not come. At first, it seemed harmless, perhaps they had lost track of time, perhaps they were lingering in the woods nearby, searching for frogs or fireflies. Yet with each passing minute, the air grew heavier, the silence sharper. Parents walked to the playground, expecting to scold their children for dawdling. Instead, they found it eerily still. A swing creaked back and forth, as though it had only just been abandoned. A small rubber ball rested at the base of the slide, motionless. The red ribbon that had been tied neatly into the youngest girl's hair earlier that day was nowhere to be seen, though her mother swore she had fastened it tightly. Neighbors joined in, voices rising louder, more urgent, names called again and again into the twilight. Someone swore they heard laughter echoing faintly in the distance, though no one could agree on where it came from. Others insisted they saw shadows moving toward the tree line, only to find nothing when they ran to investigate. Confusion began to spread, then unease, then fear. How could 5 children simply vanish in a town so small, a place where nothing ever went unnoticed? The minutes stretched into hours. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the glow of porch lights and the dim beams of flashlights cutting across the fields. Parents searched the woods, calling until their voices cracked. Dogs were brought out to track scents, but they circled the playground in frustration, whimpering, as though the trail had simply ended. It was in those early hours, before law enforcement arrived in force, that the enormity of the situation began to sink in. A mother collapsed onto the bench near the swings, clutching the notebook her daughter had left behind, pages fluttering in the evening breeze. A father slammed his fist against the monkey bars until his knuckles bled, as though the playground itself had betrayed him. Children who lived nearby were pulled indoors, their parents' hands gripping their shoulders too tightly, fear etched into every face. The last day scene is remembered less as a sequence of events and more as a breaking point. It is the moment when an ordinary afternoon became extraordinary in the worst possible way. It is the fracture between before and after, the moment when time split open and the town stepped into an unending shadow. The images of that day are seared into memory: a swing still moving without a rider, a ball at rest in the grass, the echo of names shouted into silence. No one knew then that they were witnessing the opening chapter of a mystery that would last more than half a century. To them, in that moment, it was only panic, only disbelief. They searched, they prayed, they hoped. But the children never came home. And the ordinary day, the sandwiches, the laughter, the scribbled drawings, the red ribbon, became the town's eternal haunting. The search began the way all searches do, hurried, chaotic, fueled by the belief that the children must be close by, that they had simply wandered too far into the fields or lost track of time in the woods. At first, there was a sense of urgency but also of certainty: they would be found. Parents called their names with voices sharpened by panic, lanterns swung through the growing darkness, neighbors scattered across backyards and alleys. The playground, once full of noise, became a base of operations, a gathering point where mothers clutched one another's hands and fathers set off in different directions, determined to return with their children in tow. The first night stretched long, heavy, endless. Flashlights cut through the fields, beams sweeping across tall grass and fence lines. A search party entered the woods that bordered the town, stumbling over roots and underbrush, shouting names into the stillness. Dogs barked and strained against their leashes, circling the same patch of ground as if frustrated by a trail that vanished too quickly. The air was thick with the kind of silence that feels unnatural, broken only by the occasional call that echoed back unanswered. By dawn, nothing had changed. No footprints, no belongings, no children. Just the same unbearable absence. The following morning, the sheriff called for more help. Deputies were summoned from neighboring counties, and volunteers poured in: farmers, shopkeepers, even teenagers eager to join the effort. Lines of people walked shoulder to shoulder across fields, combing every inch of ground. They checked barns, sheds, ditches. Men dragged the river with ropes and hooks while women handed out coffee from thermoses, refusing to go home though exhaustion bent their shoulders. The town's small church opened its doors, and prayers filled the sanctuary, voices trembling with desperation. What began as an organized effort soon grew frantic. Parents tore through abandoned farmhouses on the edge of town, prying open doors, climbing into attics, convinced they might find a clue hidden in dust and cobwebs. Others dug through brush piles, overturned hay bales, searched along train tracks where rusting freight cars sat idle. Every sound made hearts leap: a snapped twig, a dog's bark, a rustle in the leaves. Every silence felt like defeat. The grief of the family showed itself in different ways. Some mothers stood still, frozen on the edge of the playground as though afraid to move too far, as if staying rooted there might draw their children back. Others walked until their feet blistered, driven by the fear of stopping. Fathers worked with a ferocity that bordered on violence, ripping open locked doors, splintering boards with crowbars, shouting in voices that cracked. They searched as though they could force the world to give back what it had taken. The wider world soon took notice. Reporters arrived, their cameras intruding on moments of anguish, their headlines turning the small town into a spectacle. Flashbulbs lit up tired faces, and questions were asked again and again. Had anyone seen strangers in town? Were there cars that didn't belong? Did anyone hear anything unusual? Every answer seemed both too small and too large. Suspicion grew in whispers, pointed glances at neighbors, muttered doubts about who could be trusted. The sense of community that once held the town together began to crack under the weight of fear. Days turned into weeks. The initial rush of volunteers thinned as fatigue set in. The sheriff's office, unequipped for a mystery of this magnitude, found itself drowning in dead ends. Maps were covered with pins marking search zones, but every pin led only to disappointment. Parents clung to rumors: no matter how implausible, a child spotted in a nearby county, a figure seen leading a group down a dirt road. Each rumor sent them rushing off, hearts pounding, only to end in bitter emptiness. The seasons themselves seemed to mock the search. Summer's warmth faded into autumn's chill, leaves falling across the playground like a slow burial. Snow arrived, covering the ground in white silence, erasing what little evidence might have remained. By the time spring returned, the search had shifted from hope to ritual. Some parents still walked the fields every evening, their lanterns glowing like small, stubborn stars. Others retreated into themselves, grief hardening into something wordless. Perhaps the most haunting part of the search was not what was found but what wasn't. No shoes abandoned in the grass. No ribbon snagged on a branch. No scrawled note, no broken toy. Nothing. The children had not only vanished, they had left no trace at all. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole, leaving only questions behind. That absence became the heaviest burden of all. By the end of the first year, official searches slowed. Authorities could not justify endless resources, and volunteers had lives that demanded their return. But for the families, the search never ended. Every unfamiliar sound, every passing car, every knock at the door became another possibility. Mothers jolted awake at night, convinced they had heard a familiar voice. Fathers followed shadows at the edge of their fields, hearts pounding as though answers might be hidden there. The playground itself was left to rust and rot, but parents returned to it again and again, walking among the empty swings as though retracing their children's steps might somehow bridge the gap between presence and absence. The search that consumed the town was not only a physical one, it was emotional, spiritual, eternal. It was the desperate reaching of human hands into darkness, unwilling to accept that nothing could be found. And though the search itself eventually slowed, the hunger for answers never did. Every face in town became a suspect. Every silence carried the weight of secrets. Every year that passed only deepened the wound. It is said that grief takes many forms, but in this town, grief became a landscape. It covered the fields, the woods, the rivers. It pressed against every window and seeped into every prayer. The people searched not only for their children but for the return of certainty, for the restoration of a world that had once felt safe. They never found it. The search consumed the town, and when it ended, the emptiness remained. The decades that followed were not measured in years but in silence. Time stretched, but it did not heal. Instead, it laid itself like dust over the town, coating memories, dulling color, softening edges, yet never erasing the wound. 51 years is a long time to live without answers, and yet for those left behind, the absence never grew easier to bear. It was as though the clock had stopped in 1972, and though the world moved forward, new presidents, new wars, new technologies, the town remained suspended, caught between what was lost and what could never be found. Families carried the weight in different ways. Some clung to hope with white knuckles, insisting that one day the truth would emerge, that their children might walk through the door grown and alive. Others surrendered to grief, allowing it to hollow them out until they became shadows of who they had once been. Marriages cracked under the pressure, partners turning their sorrow against one another, accusing, resenting, or retreating into silence. Birthdays passed uncelebrated, empty chairs sat at holiday tables, and every year that slipped by seemed to widen the gulf between memory and reality. The town itself reflected the fracture. The playground where it all began was left to rust, a graveyard of metal and weeds. The slide dulled to a lifeless gray, the swings sagged, and the once bright paint chipped away in flakes. What had been the heartbeat of the community became a monument to absence, avoided by some, visited like a shrine by others. Children who grew up in the years after the disappearance were warned never to stray too far, never to trust the woods, never to ignore the call to come home before dusk. The vanished five became less like individuals and more like cautionary ghosts, invoked whenever fear or discipline was needed. Whispers clung to the town like fog. Every stranger who passed through was eyed with suspicion, every locked door or solitary resident speculated about. Rumors fed on themselves, that the children had been taken by a drifter, that they had been spirited away to a city, that someone within the town had known more than they admitted. As years passed, the speculation hardened into folklore, told around dinner tables and in hushed tones at schoolyards. For the younger generations, who had not lived through the day itself, the disappearance became something mythical, a story used to explain why the town had the haunted look it did, why their parents' smiles sometimes faltered, why trust always seemed to have an edge of fear. The silence of official channels only deepened the wound. Investigations stalled, files grew dusty, evidence boxes were pushed into storage rooms where they yellowed with time. Officers retired, new ones took their place, but the case remained unsolved, its unanswered questions becoming a curse inherited by each new sheriff. For families, the silence was unbearable. Every knock on the door might have been news, every phone call might have been the one. But the calls never came. Only silence, unbroken and unrelenting. And yet, life went on in fractured ways. Babies were born, children grew, crops were planted, shops opened and closed. The rhythms of life demanded to be followed, even when grief pressed against every moment. The tragedy became a quiet backdrop, something unspoken yet ever present. Neighbors who had once joined together in frantic search began avoiding eye contact, weary of carrying the same questions without answers. The town grew smaller as people left, unwilling to live in a place where memory was suffocating. Those who stayed behind learned to live in the shadow of that silence, though it bent their shoulders and dimmed their voices. By the 1990s, the story of the 5 vanished children had become both infamous and forgotten. Outside the town, it was another cold case in a list of mysteries that journalists might dust off for a feature article now and then. Inside, it was a wound people were tired of reopening. Parents who had once spoken loudly about their grief grew quiet, as if words had lost their power. Siblings who had been too young to understand when the disappearance happened grew up carrying the identity of the one left behind. They were shaped by an absence they could barely remember but never escape. And still, the silence held. No letters arrived, no belongings were uncovered, no one confessed. The children remained as missing as the day they disappeared. The town aged, but the mystery did not. It remained fixed, immovable, like an iron weight. Each anniversary became a ritual, candles lit, names spoken aloud, moments of silence observed. But the silence always stretched further than the words could reach. 51 years of silence is not simply the passage of time without answers. It is a transformation. Silence becomes a companion, a constant presence in every conversation, every shadow, every dream. It shapes the way people live, the way they trust, the way they remember. For the families, silence was not an absence of sound but a sound all its own, loud, echoing, endless. It filled rooms, lingered in hallways, followed them into sleep. By the time half a century had passed, the disappearance of the 5 children was not just history but identity. The town was no longer known for its river, its hills, or its community. It was known for what it had lost, for the voices it never heard again. The silence defined it, both inside and out. And though the world around it moved forward, that town, and the people who carried its memories, remained suspended in that unending, unanswered echo. It was in the 51st year after the disappearance, long after the search had faded into memory, that something unexpected stirred the silence. The discovery did not come from police work or a late-night confession. It came from demolition. An old house, abandoned for decades, stood at the far edge of town, its roof sagging, its windows shattered by storms. The property had been purchased by a developer who planned to clear the land and start fresh. Workers moved through the sagging structure with hammers and crowbars, peeling away walls that smelled of mildew, prying loose boards swollen by rain. They expected rot, not revelation. Yet beneath the warped floorboards of a back room, hidden under layers of dust and debris, they found something that should not have been there. It was a chest, large, iron-bound, heavy enough that 3 men strained to drag it out into the light. Its surface was scarred with rust, its hinges sealed by time, its padlock thick and unyielding. There was something unsettling about the way it looked, as though it had been waiting. The workers paused, uneasy. Chests are supposed to hold heirlooms, tools, maybe forgotten keepsakes. But this one, buried so deliberately, radiated secrecy. One of the men ran his hand across the lid and muttered that it felt wrong, though he couldn't say why. Another joked nervously about treasure, but no one laughed. In silence, they called the police. The news spread quickly, carried on whispers and hurried phone calls. Within hours, the street outside the crumbling house was crowded. Police cars idled, lights flashing against the dusk, while townsfolk gathered at a distance, unwilling to leave. For a town that had lived half a century under the weight of unanswered questions, the word chest was like a match dropped into dry grass. People leaned over fences, murmuring theories, daring to believe that the silence might finally break. For some, it was hope, for others, dread. What could a locked chest reveal, after so long, but the very thing they had been unable to face? The police approached with caution. They noted the location, the condition, the way the chest had been hidden beneath the floor rather than stored openly. It was not a piece of furniture someone had forgotten. It had been buried deliberately, concealed where no one was meant to find it. That act alone carried meaning. To hide something is to protect it, or to keep it from ever being seen. Either way, the chest was a message from the past, one that demanded to be opened. And yet, the chest resisted. The lock was heavy, its iron teeth sealed with rust. Attempts to pry it open at the sight failed, the metal groaning but refusing to yield. So it was loaded onto a truck and carried away, chained and strapped as though it were alive, as though it might try to escape. Watching it depart, some in the crowd whispered that it should have been left where it was, that opening it might unleash something better left buried. But others, parents still alive, siblings now old with gray hair, stood rigid, eyes burning with desperate anticipation. For them, the chest was not a threat but a possibility. After half a century of silence, even the faintest possibility was everything. The chest was placed under guard, stored in a secure room at the sheriff's office. Reporters descended on the town almost immediately, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp. They asked whether it could be connected to the missing children, whether evidence might lie within. Officials answered carefully, insisting nothing could be known until the chest was opened. But the people of the town knew better. They felt it in their bones. The chest was not random, not meaningless. It was part of the story that had defined them, waiting for the moment when its secrets would no longer stay hidden. In the days that followed, tension gripped the community. For the families, sleep was impossible. They lingered outside the sheriff's office, pacing, smoking cigarettes, praying. Old wounds reopened, arguments resurfaced, blame flickered again between neighbors. Every hour that passed without answers deepened the ache. Children and grandchildren who had grown up under the shadow of the disappearance watched the older generation unravel, realizing how fragile the silence had truly been. The town buzzed with speculation. Would the chest contain belongings? Letters? A confession? Or something darker, something they feared but had to face? The chest itself took on an almost mythical presence. People spoke of it as though it had a will, as though it had chosen its moment. For 51 years it had hidden, silent and sealed, while lives unraveled around it. Now it had emerged, forcing the town to return to questions they had never been able to answer. There was no turning away. The lock would have to be broken, the lid lifted, the secrets revealed. And whatever waited inside, it would change everything. But the chest was not opened immediately. For a brief stretch of time, it simply existed, impenetrable, heavy, silent. That waiting became its own kind of torment. The people gathered in hushed circles outside the sheriff's office, imagining the possibilities, each theory heavier than the last. Inside, officials prepared carefully, aware that they were not just opening a container but unraveling 51 years of grief. The chest held the weight of history, and soon, it would speak. The silence of 5 decades had not broken yet, but the chest had appeared like a crack in the wall. Something was coming. And for the first time in half a century, the town found itself holding its breath, bracing for the moment the lock would give way. The chest did not open with ease. It resisted the first blows of the locksmith's hammer, the groan of old metal echoing through the sheriff's office like a cry. The air was thick with expectation. Family members of the missing children sat in hard chairs along the wall, their hands clenched, their eyes hollow with the ache of years. Reporters waited just outside the building, pressing their ears against doors, desperate for a first glimpse. Inside, the lock finally cracked, iron teeth snapping apart with a sound that felt almost alive. For a moment, no one breathed. The sheriff placed his hands on the lid, his palms trembling, and then with a slow, deliberate push, the chest was opened. At first, there was only darkness, a cavity of shadow, the smell of rust and earth rising like a ghost from within. Then shapes emerged, bundles wrapped in cloth, tied tightly with twine that had darkened over time. The cloth was stiff, discolored, the twine frayed but intact. Each bundle was lifted carefully and placed on the table. The room had fallen into a silence so deep that even the ticking of the clock sounded accusatory. No one dared move too quickly, afraid that the truth inside might shatter if handled carelessly. The first bundle was opened slowly. Inside lay objects that seemed ordinary, but each one struck with the weight of recognition. A child's shoe, its leather cracked, the laces brittle. A notebook, its pages warped, scrawled with handwriting that faltered mid-sentence. A small toy car, paint-chipped, the kind a child might clutch in a pocket as a secret companion. Each item was a piece of someone who had been missing, someone whose name had been spoken in prayers for decades. The families leaned forward, their bodies rigid with pain. Some gasped softly, others turned away, unable to look. It was as though the children had been reduced to relics, pieces of themselves locked away in silence for half a century. But the chest held more. Beneath the bundles lay a box of photographs, their edges curled, their colors faded to sepia. The images were unsettling, children at play, captured from a distance. The faces were familiar, unmistakable. The 5 who had vanished, frozen in moments of laughter, unaware they were being watched. The angle of the shot suggested secrecy, a hidden lens from behind bushes or across streets. Someone had followed them, documented them, preserved them in photographs that now trembled in the hands of investigators. The parents cried out softly, their grief raw and uncontainable. These were the last glimpses of their children alive, not memories preserved with love but with obsession. At the very bottom of the chest lay something heavier, journals, their covers cracked, their pages dense with handwriting. The ink had faded in places, blurred by moisture, but the words were still legible. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, the words meticulous. The journals were not the children's. They belonged to someone else, someone who wrote of them, who described their routines, their personalities, their vulnerabilities. The entries began years before the disappearance, documenting small details: what time the children walked home from school, which of them lingered at the playground, who trusted strangers too easily. Each line felt invasive, chilling, a window into a mind that had watched and waited. The deeper investigators read, the darker the words became. The journal entries shifted from observation to possession. "They belong to me now," one line declared, etched in shaky handwriting that suggested frenzy. Another page spoke of the day itself, describing how the children had been lured with promises of candy, of games, of secrets to be told. The entries did not confess directly to what happened after, but the implication was suffocating. The writer had claimed them, taken them, hidden them. And for 51 years, that claim had been buried in silence. The families collapsed under the weight of these revelations. Mothers who had once clung to hope now sobbed uncontrollably, their hands covering their faces. Fathers sat motionless, fists pressed against their knees, as though still trying to hold themselves together after decades of waiting. Some could not bear to remain in the room, stumbling into the hallways where grief echoed in their cries. For them, the chest was both an answer and a cruelty. It offered truth, but not the kind that healed. Instead, it confirmed that their children had been taken, not lost to accident or fate, but to someone's deliberate and monstrous design. The sheriff closed the journals gently, his face ashen. He spoke quietly, promising that every page would be examined, every detail preserved. But the words felt small against the enormity of what had been uncovered. The chest had not given them closure. It had given them evidence of obsession, of violation, of years stolen without explanation. It had given them fragments of the children they loved, but not the children themselves. News of the discovery spread beyond the town within hours. Headlines screamed of the chest, of the photographs, of the journals that hinted at a hidden predator. Television crews swarmed the area, their bright lights piercing the darkness that had cloaked the town for so long. For outsiders, it was a story to consume, a mystery revealed, a narrative of horror and intrigue. But for the people who lived there, for the families who had carried grief for 51 years, it was not spectacle. It was salt poured into an unhealed wound. In the weeks that followed, investigators combed through every page, every photograph, every relic. The chest had cracked open the silence, but it had not ended it. It had only deepened the mystery. Who had kept these items? Why had they been buried? Why had no trace of the children themselves been found inside? The chest was not a conclusion. It was an opening, a doorway into questions more terrifying than the silence had ever been. And as the town absorbed the weight of what had been uncovered, one truth became clear: the children's story was not over. The chest had given them voices again, but it had also awakened something long hidden. The silence had been broken, but what waited beyond it might be darker still. The revelation of the chest did not land like a single strike of lightning, it spread like wildfire. The moment the contents became public, the town, already scarred, already brittle, splintered once more. Old wounds tore open, and new ones formed. What had been hidden beneath 51 years of silence now sat in the open like a festering wound that refused to close. The children's shoes, their toys, the photographs, the journals, each artifact carried a weight too heavy to bear, and together they crushed whatever fragile peace the town had built over decades. The families of the missing 5 were the first to unravel. For years they had been forced to construct their lives around absence, to survive on fragments of memory. They had spoken of hope when it felt hollow, smiled for the living while grieving the lost. But the chest made denial impossible. It proved that someone had stolen their children, that the absence had been deliberate, orchestrated by a hand they still could not name. Parents in their 80s wept like children themselves, their bodies breaking under grief too long restrained. Siblings, now grandparents in their own right, felt their identities collapse. They had been the ones left behind, but now they carried the knowledge that their brothers and sisters had been watched, stalked, catalogued like prey. It was too much, and many withdrew entirely from the public eye, unable to bear the questions, the cameras, the endless replaying of their pain. For the rest of the town, the effect was no less devastating. Fear, which had once dulled with time, returned with sharp edges. The journals suggested that someone among them, someone who had lived in that town, walked its streets, perhaps smiled in passing, had been capable of unspeakable things. Every old neighbor, every reclusive figure, every family name once whispered with suspicion was dredged up again. Rumors thickened the air, that the writer of the journals had been the old groundskeeper, that it had been the quiet woman who lived alone near the woods, that it had been one of the policemen who had botched the original investigation. None of it was proven, but suspicion is not a thing that needs proof to thrive. People eyed each other with a wariness that felt both new and ancient. The playground, long abandoned and rusting, became a site of pilgrimage once more. People left flowers, toys, photographs of their own children, as though trying to protect what could not be saved. Others gathered there at night, whispering about curses, about ghosts that still lingered. It became less a place of play than a shrine to absence, glowing faintly with candlelight that guttered in the wind. Yet even in this collective mourning, divisions widened. Some residents demanded the chest be locked away, its images and journals sealed forever. Others insisted the truth, however brutal, must be laid bare. Arguments broke out in the town square, in churches, in the aisles of the grocery store. The chest had not only unearthed secrets, it had unearthed fractures buried within the town itself. The children growing up in the present day were caught in the undertow of this unraveling. They listened to parents and grandparents speak in hushed tones, saw the way adults turned away from each other, the way grief leaked into every corner of life. They were told the old warnings again: don't wander too far, don't trust strangers, come home before dark. But now the warnings carried a new weight. They were not rooted in folklore or cautionary tales. They were rooted in proof, in photographs of children just like them, smiling in a playground before vanishing forever. Childhood itself felt more fragile in the town, every laugh or game shadowed by the fear of eyes watching from the trees. The church bell tolled one Sunday morning, calling people together in an attempt at unity. But even there, grief could not be smoothed into comfort. The pastor's words about healing were swallowed by sobs from the pews, by the anger of fathers who shouted that forgiveness was impossible, by the silence of mothers who could not bear to speak. Some prayed for the children's souls, others demanded justice from a system that had failed them. When the service ended, people did not leave hand in hand, they left in clusters, fractured, unable to meet each other's eyes. Meanwhile, the outside world feasted. Journalists and television crews swarmed the town, circling like vultures over carrion. For them, the chest was a headline, a spectacle, a tragic mystery to dramatize for viewers. But for the townspeople, it was personal, raw, unbearable. The intrusion only deepened the unraveling. Outsiders asked questions with casual cruelty. Do you think your neighbor was involved? How does it feel to know your child was taken? Families recoiled, humiliated and furious. The line between private grief and public story dissolved, leaving the town exposed, defenseless. In quiet corners, darker currents stirred. Some whispered that perhaps the chest should never have been opened, that the silence, however cruel, had at least allowed people to survive. The truth, they said, was a poison. Others countered that the silence had been the real poison, festering for 51 years. These debates echoed in kitchens, in taverns, in living rooms lit by television screens replaying images of the chest again and again. The town was alive with noise, but beneath it all was the same old silence, the unanswered question of who had written those journals, who had watched those children, who had hidden their relics in iron walls. And so the unraveling continued. Families drifted further apart. Neighbors ceased waving across fences. Once friendly streets grew colder, every shadow thick with suspicion. The chest had broken the silence, but what replaced it was not peace. It was noise, chaos, grief reborn and sharpened into anger. The town had waited half a century for answers, but the answers that emerged only deepened the void. It was as though the 5 children had vanished all over again, this time not from a playground, but from memory itself, absorbed into artifacts, into journals, into headlines. They had been transformed into symbols, into myths, into grief made permanent. And the town, no matter how it tried, could not weave itself back together. The chest had returned their story to them, but it had also ensured that the unraveling would never truly end. The investigation into the journals began slowly, methodically, with gloves and magnifying glasses and the quiet dread of knowing that every word they uncovered carried the weight of children who had never come home. Experts were brought in, handwriting analysts, archivists, even psychologists who specialized in criminal pathology. The journals were fragile, their pages stained by time, yet the words were steady, precise, as though the writer had known they were leaving behind a legacy. Each page was like a pulse from the past, steady and cold, echoing into the present. At first, the entries seemed harmless in their detail, almost mundane. Notes on what time the school bell rang, who walked home with whom, which parents lingered to watch from the sidewalk. But the more the investigators read, the more sinister the details became. The writer was not simply observing, they were collecting. They documented the way one child's laughter carried louder than the rest, the way another lingered at the slide as though reluctant to leave, the way the smallest of the five clutched a toy car like a talisman. These were not casual notes. They were possession disguised as description, obsession hidden beneath the mask of observation. The handwriting itself revealed patterns. Analysts noted shifts, moments when the writer pressed too hard, the ink bleeding into the paper as if emotion had cracked through their controlled facade. Certain words were repeated obsessively: mine, belong, forever. Psychologists warned that this was not the work of someone who stumbled into violence. It was the mind of someone who had built a shrine in language, preparing themselves to act long before